For our project, we designed a novel copper-based intrauterine device intended to improve patient experience and clinical outcomes. Contraception is a means of preventing unintended pregnancies through numerous methods. There are many underlying factors that could influence a user's choice for birth control with varying levels of invasiveness and user interface. Long-acting contraception is a subset that is known to be effective for long periods of time without the interference of the user. While oral contraceptives can be used for long periods of time, they must be taken every day in order to reach maximum efficacy. This leaves intrauterine devices, sterilization, rod implantation, and a hysterectomy as the most common long-acting contraceptive methods. In order to be considered reversible, a contraceptive method must cease preventing pregnancy upon its removal. It must also not result in any long-term side effects for the user. For this reason, IUDs are often referred to as long-acting reversible contraception and are used by upwards of 7.43 million women in the US. This number represents 14% of all people who use contraception, but has seen significant growth in the past decade. The market for IUDs in the US is expected to grow by $800 million by 2023. IUDs are of two main varieties, hormonal and copper. Hormonal IUDs use a drug called levonorgestrel to prevent ovulation and thus pregnancy. Copper IUDs use a controlled release of cupric ions to create a spermicidal environment as well as regulate the expression of genes necessary for zygote implantation. There are currently 4 FDA-approved hormonal IUDs, Mirena, Kyleena, Skyla, and Liletta. All 4 options are T-shaped IUDs that release varying levels of levonorgestrel. While 75% of IUD users choose hormonal, the remaining quarter pick copper. Those who choose copper IUDs often do so because they're unable to use hormonal IUDs for medical reasons. Patients at a higher risk of thromboembolism, lupus, migraines, and genetic syndromes that result in breast cancer are often barred from using synthetic hormones. If this is the case, the only FDA-approved option for a copper IUD is the Paragard T380A. Because of this, our target audience is those who are not able to safely use hormonal-based long-acting reversible contraception. We seek to directly compete with the Paragard non-hormonal IUD because a patient is not a summation of their conditions, rather an entire person entitled to a safe and comfortable contraceptive option. While the Paragard IUD does provide our target audience with an option for a non-hormonal contraceptive method, it has numerous drawbacks that result in less than 40% of clinicians recommending it to patients. 2/3 of all users reported a significant increase in menstrual bleeding and cramping in the first 6 months after implantation due to the burst release effect of copper ions. A 6-fold increase in genital tract infection has been observed post-implantation as well. The expulsion rate of the Paragard IUD is over 17%, with increased risk of uterine wall perforation and device migration. IUDs are inserted into the uterine body where they cause localized changes in the uterine wall lining, the endometrium. Upon insemination and subsequent egg fertilization, a newly formed zygote will implant itself into the superficial layer of the endometrium and continue to grow. IUDs are able to create a spermicidal environment by eliciting a foreign body response that increases the concentration of granulocyte macrophage colony stimulating factor and interleukin-2 in the uterus, as well as increasing macrophage presence, which aids in killing sperm before they're able to reach the fallopian tubes. The foreign body response also results in increased secretion of the cytokine interleukin-1 beta, which greatly decreases the expression of HOXA10 genes and thus the translation of HOXA10 proteins. HOXA10 proteins regulate the receptivity of the uterine wall to an incoming zygote by promoting cyclical morphological changes of the endometrium. With the decrease in HOXA10 proteins, the mucosal lining of the endometrium thickens and becomes averse to zygote implantation. As mentioned before, the Paragard T380 is the only FDA-approved copper IUD in the US, but novel designs have implemented in other countries. Gynafix is a frameless IUD that is attached to the myometrium of the uterine wall. Its increased cupric surface area and implantation method make it unlikely to solve the problems with Paragard. The IUD ballerine is composed of a polyurethane frame common to Paragard and most hormonal IUDs, but has 2 entwined circles with balls of copper dispersed along the frame. Its surface area is an improvement over the Paragard IUD, but is still susceptible to the burst release of copper ions and results in increased device migration.
In considering uterine anatomy and the unmet clinical needs that the aforementioned copper IUDs do not fully address, we propose a galvanically corroding copper-based intrauterine device. Our device frame presents as an inverted hollow pear shape, measuring 32 millimeters long and 3 millimeters thick. The transverse width tapers from 25 millimeters to 12.5 millimeters, with 2 50-millimeter strings for device check and removal. Our device will manipulate 5 raw materials to create an improved patient experience and better clinical outcomes. The copper is the key component of our device. The tissue responses to copper are the primary mechanism for successful contraceptive. The contraceptive methods are chiefly controlled by the rate of ion elution, and the acute inflammatory response is designed to last throughout implantation. The device will use grade 1 copper wiring adherent to ASTM F68 on 3 separate areas exposed at 67 square millimeters each, which results in a total copper release of 20 to 80 micrograms a day. The wire has a uniform diameter of 0.255 millimeters. The proximal end of the wire will be anchored into the frame and uniformly wound. The distal end will be tucked into the frame, and the entire frame and the copper will be polished and barrel tumbled to prevent sharp edges in utero. The copper will be sterilized at 40 kilograms of gamma radiation, and the wiring itself is relatively inexpensive, but the toll it takes in utero is not insignificant. The burst release effect of copper during the first 6 months of device lifespan is a significant deterrent. To address what burst release is and how our device will account for it, we look to a 2015 study which investigated such occurrences in vitro. The IUD working range requires cupric ion release between 20 to 80 micrograms a day, and the patient should not experience high bleeding and cramping relative to their baseline during this time. However, during the first 3 to 6 months after implantation, elution rates can be upwards of 200 micrograms. The 75-25 PLGA functions like a sieve, where an appropriate amount of copper ions are released from the device to ensure functionality, but not so high that the patient experiences discomfort. The phenomenon of burst release on a control Paragard and a coated Paragard can be seen in Figure 13. After 3 to 6 months, the polymer should undergo complete surface degradation. To ensure this, the 75-25 PLGA will be dissolved in 10% weight by volume ethyl acetate, film wrapped onto the exposed copper surfaces. The polymer will be sterilized using ethylate oxide gas. Additionally, the polymer does present low risks such as fibrotic encapsulation, blocking device efficacy. Nitinol 55 is the primary metal for the device frame. The device's shape memory component is crucial, and the superelastic behavior observed in utero will successfully counteract intrauterine compressive forces between 1 to 7 newtons. Such compressions are common immediately after device insertion as the uterus attempts to expel the device. Our device has shape retention abilities in spite of these forces to create a safer user experience, in addition to offering a transverse width that more closely matches uterine width at roughly 24 millimeters. Oversized devices like the Paragard often rotate 90 degrees in utero. The device frame that we have will also double as a cathode. As Figure 14 shows, both the nickel and titanium are cathodic relative to copper in salt water. The thermodynamically favorable copper oxidation in utero also allows us to decrease the surface area to 200 square millimeters total. The nitinol raw material is sterilized with 40 kilograms, and it is inexpensive. However, it requires remelting and casting, which both demand high compositional control. Furthermore, the occurrence of nickel toxicity cannot be ignored. We plan to decrease nickel presence in utero by decreasing the exposed surface area of nitinol as much as possible, where a 2020 study links high corrosion resistance to exposed surface areas below 10 square centimeters. Now, given the increased occurrences of upper and lower genital tract infections, our device seeks to create a frontline defense which can protect the patient until consulting their clinician. We plan to hydrothermally treat the nitinol frame in a steel thermal reaction vessel for silver acetate to deposit silver nanoparticles onto the frame. Once in utero, the silver nanoparticles will display antimicrobial and antibiofilm properties in a variety of ways, as shown in Figure 15. The primary mechanism of action is for the nanoparticles to anchor in and penetrate into the bacterial cell wall. And though the raw material is reasonably priced for the amount of silver acetate required, steel reaction vessels can cost upwards of thousands of dollars. Furthermore, the mechanisms for silver pathogen killing can also trigger a cytotoxic response. The amount of deposited silver must fall within a very specific range to meet anticipated outcomes while not causing significant side effects. Now, the high-density polyethylene monofilament strings adherent to ASTM D638 will be able to maintain tensile forces of up to 10 newtons for device check. Above 10 newtons, the device should be able to collapse and exit. They are designed to be checked every year during the patient's gynecology visit, and the neon green string color will be able to contrast nicely to the native tissue, allowing for easier check and removal on the clinician end. The monofilament will be processed via extrusion methods to achieve a diameter of 0.25 millimeters. The polymer will be sterilized with ethylene oxide gas. Similar to the PLGA polymer, however, the polyethylene may provoke fibrotic encapsulation, but because this device is medically inserted using the patient's own anatomy, meaning no incisions are made, we are only anticipating a low to moderate inflammatory response for both of these polymers.
The insertion of our device can be performed in a gynecologist's office in less than 15 minutes. Our deployment process must be relatively straightforward. We will require the clinician to bend the device side curves down towards the vertical midline of the device and place it in a 40 kilogram gamma sterilized 200 millimeter polyethylene tube. The clinician will direct the tube upwards towards the patient uterine cavity and push a plunger in to deploy the device. The clinician will have to fold the arms and shape memory component. The shape memory component should counteract any incorrect insertion procedures. For removal, the clinician will guide a pair of forceps up into the patient's cervix and grasp the monofilament strings. The device sidearms will collapse and the device frame will become an oblong oval shape and easily exit the patient.
The biggest tissue response from implantation will be an inflammatory response, which is part of the primary mechanism of contraception. Essentially, the mucus layer lining the endometrium will thicken, and there will be a slight increase in cytokine production, which will ultimately restrict the motion of the sperm cells and kill them. The device will also create a mildly cytotoxic environment using the antimicrobial and antibiofilm properties of silver nanoparticles. Too much silver can cause high cytotoxicity, which can damage the endometrium. However, this is seen only at doses at or above 100 micrograms per milliliter, which our device will fall well below. But the cytotoxicity will still be evaluated according to ISO standards. There's also a pretty small chance of fibrotic encapsulation. Connective tissue has been shown to encapsulate HDPE and PLGA on rare cases, and this would cause device removal issues and efficacy issues. But once the PLGA degrades, there is no more risk than for other IUDs that are currently on the market. So there are 6 main criteria that our device must meet. It must release copper at a known and controllable rate for the IUD to function as a contraceptive. It must reduce the amount of initial inflammation, which is tackled with the PLGA coating we put on there. It must decrease the rate of uterine perforation with rounded edges and a less aggressive shape. It must minimize migration of the device with a symmetrical device and design and a form-fitting shape. It must release silver particles to aid in decreasing infection. And it must withstand intrauterine forces, which is tackled with the shape memory frame.
In order to ensure that our device meets these engineering criteria, we will run a series of biomechanical, biocompatible, and biofunctional tests. The first biomechanical test will be the ability of the device to withstand intrauterine forces. We will test this in vitro using cyclic compression with 50 newtons of force, which is the max force that the device will experience in the uterus. For our animal models, we will use an olive baboon for the large animal model due to its similar anatomy and physiology to humans, and rats will be used for the small animal model due to their well-established contraceptive markers. We will use monthly ultrasounds in order to perform a shape and migration analysis once our device is implanted in these models. To determine the necessary force to remove the device, we will run a tension test and determine at what force the side arms of the device collapse, allowing it to be removed. A force gauge will be used when removing our device from the animal models in order to achieve this force. For the material transition temperature, we will determine the necessary temperature for our device to return to its heat set shape. And when implanted in the animal model, we will ensure that our device deploys. In order to determine the cytotoxicity, hemocompatibility, and carcinogenic properties of our device, we will use a mouse fibroblast line in order to examine cell shape and mass or changes in the rate of cell proliferation. For our in vivo model, we will collect the cervical mucus and test for cytokine levels, as well as GM, CSF, and IL-2SR, which are growth factors associated with high levels of inflammation in the uterus. We will also seek to determine the rate of copper elution from our device. We will do this using a wash study that includes our device with its PLGA coating and a device with an equivalent amount of copper without the PLGA coating. For our in vivo study, we will test the cervical mucus in order to determine the amount of copper that is eluted from our device.
The unit costs for each raw material were found by consulting commercial websites. We tabulated a total cost of $337. We anticipate the cost to increase due to insertion fees. The Paraguard IUD can end up being between $500 and $1,300, but 95% of all U.S. insurance companies cover the device. We believe once we can demonstrate improvements upon the Paraguard, we can become a competitive option that could replace Paraguard for many insurance companies.
To summarize, our device is an improvement over current devices on the market because it combats the risk of infection and perforation due to its pear shape and rounded edges. It decreases cramping and bleeding because of its polymer coating and smaller copper surface area, and it lowers the risk of infection due to the antimicrobial properties of copper and silver. Our device does have a decreased lifespan compared to devices currently on the market of 5 years compared to 10 years. However, 76% of users stop using the current model after only 5 years due to problems outlined earlier in our presentation. Additionally, we will require a new procedure for clinicians to learn in order to insert our device. However, there have already been calls for new implantation methods due to the high rates of migration with current devices. Thank you, and does anyone have any questions?